Good morning. This is Loren coming to you from the Tanglewood Wellness Center in Costa Rica. And we're going to be speaking this morning a little bit about emotional poise. As I mentioned to you guys briefly the other day, oftentimes, even when people know exactly what they need to do to meet the body's physical needs, they have trouble actually doing it on a consistent basis. And it's not because they don't know what to do, they do. It's because something drives them to make relatively poor choices. And I believe it's very simply whether or not we're capable or able, willing perhaps, to deal with our own emotions. You know, I would point out to you that the vast majority of calories, at least 50%, maybe much more, of the calories being consumed in places like North America, maybe less so in places like this, where many more people live at a closer to a subsistence level, but certainly in the U.S. and other Western countries, the vast majority of calories being consumed are not being consumed because people actually need food. More than 70% of the population is overweight or obese. The average person is walking around with months' worth of reserves. They don't need to eat anything. So why are people eating all the time? Primarily to suppress emotions. Primarily to suppress their emotions. And it's important to understand that our emotions serve us. They're there, they come up, they're completely natural, and they tell us that something, usually something that we're believing, isn't true. That's often what's going on. They can also be telling us that something that we value or something that we need, our needs, are or are not being met. I'm talking more about what we call negative emotions, so that would be the case where they're not being met. Okay? So we have needs, and if those needs are not being met, then the negative, quote-unquote, negative emotions come up. And I say quote-unquote because what people call negative emotions, fear, anger, etc., they're not bad, even though we're taught to believe they are. Our culture makes it very clear that these things are not okay, and that if you're experiencing them, then you're really not okay. And our culture teaches us very clearly that women shouldn't experience anger. I know families where the boys are actually allowed to fight, but God forbid a girl should get involved in any physical display of anger. Now on the other side, perhaps even more strongly, little boys all over the world are taught that it's not okay to feel sad. It's not okay. Boys don't cry. Have you heard that before? And for most of us, the way we were raised, whether our parents ever said this or not, our culture reinforces it. And so we wind up believing this and acting as if this is true, that we should not feel certain emotions, and if we are feeling them, if we do feel them, there's something wrong with us. I once had a client who spent 3 or 4 weeks with me at the center. This is many years ago. And I don't know if you guys know this, I'm a Reiki master. I was giving her a Reiki treatment. And Reiki, if you're not familiar with it, it's about moving energy through the body. And it tends, you put energy into someone's body, it tends to get energy moving. And as energy starts to move, emotions will come up sometimes. So she's on my Reiki table. She's been at the center for 3 weeks. And I see the first hint of any emotion come up. She starts to cry a little bit. Not unusual. And I said to her, this is the first I've seen of any emotion from you. I've been wondering what's going on for you emotionally. She said, well, there were a couple of times I started to cry, but I didn't let myself. I said, really? Why not? She said, well, that's a sign of weakness, right? I said to her, which branch of the military is your father in? said, he's a Marine. I mean, this is, we get this all over the culture, but nowhere more strongly than in the military. And so I'm seeing this, from a female in her 30s, this strong sense it's not okay to display sadness. Oh, your father must be in the military, and must have put that crap on you. And how does that affect us? Well, Philip Larkin, a famous English poet who's dead now, back in the 80s wrote a poem that expresses this very, very nicely. I hope it won't bother you if I use a 4-letter word. But this is art, so it's okay, right? So is that okay with everybody?
Right.
You're not going to be offended. It's not going to offend your tender sensibilities. Philip Larkin wrote, in This Be the Verse, he said, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by old-style fools in hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. And I'm pretty sure, I believe, it always drove me crazy in school when a teacher would say, this is what the poet meant. The poet's been dead for 150 years. How do you know what he meant? Right? I think Larkin intended this to be black humor. I think the conclusion was intended to be humorous, but the premise, completely serious. This is what happens. And we see this, by the way. Statistics show that children of alcoholics are much more likely to become alcoholics. And children of abusers are much more likely to become abusers. So a very sad example of this in Panama. We were in Panama 6.5 years. I had an employee, and he had, I don't remember exactly, he had like 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And his father beat his mother and all the kids growing up. All of the women married men that beat them up. And the one brother, the guy I knew, wasn't married, and one of his brothers was gay, and his other brother beat his wife. This is what they learned. This is how you do relationship. This means I love you. I'm just trying to help you to get in line. That's what we learn. It doesn't matter what words accompany it. It's the behavior. It's what we see, what's modeled for us over and over again. And so your parents may tell you, don't lie. But if they lie themselves, then they teach you to do the same thing. And I'll never forget, I think I was 6 or 7 years old, and my mother clearly told me many times it was wrong to lie. And the phone rang, and I picked it up. And I said, Mom, Mrs. Smith is on the phone for you. And she said, tell her I'm not here. Now, I didn't consciously process that necessarily, but at some level of my being, I'm going, oh, okay, so don't lie except when you need to, except when it's convenient to, except when it serves your purposes. That's what it really means, right? That's what we're really taught. That's the way it works. So let me stop for just 1 second and point something out here. Your parents were imperfect. They did fuck you up in some ways, and they didn't intend to. They were doing the very best they could. But they were simply passing along what had been passed on to them. And, for most of us, I mean, we're different generations here, perhaps, but some of our generations, around the time that I was born, some of the baby boomers, and I'm at the end of the baby boom generation, but the baby boomers were probably the first generation in history where a large number of people had the luxury of sitting around contemplating their belly buttons, thinking about their own consciousness. Because although there were obviously always kings and wealthy landlords, the people that controlled everything, they were in the minority. And the vast majority of people, until a relatively short time ago, were pretty busy just trying to get enough food on the table and keep a roof over their family's head. They didn't really have a lot of time to think about what they were up to. And yet, the only way we shift these patterns that we're likely to inherit, because it's what we've seen modeled growing up, is if we can bring enough consciousness to them. And so most of us grow up at some point probably thinking, I never want to be like my, fill in the blank, your mother or father, maybe both. I never want to be, and then someday wake up and go, oh shit, I've become that. Because again, unless we bring enough consciousness to it. And often what happens is if we're thinking, I don't want to be that, I don't want to be that, what are we doing? We're putting our energy, we're putting our attention and our consciousness on what we don't want. But we create what we focus on. It's not about what we want or don't want, it's what we focus on. So if we focus on what we don't want, we tend to create more of that. We need to be able to bring consciousness and perhaps love and forgiveness to ourselves and our parents for our own imperfections. Often it's the hardest thing. I mean, I met many people who into their 40s, 50s, and 60s are still blaming mom and or dad for how they are. And again, I think we can probably all acknowledge mom and dad didn't do a perfect job. True? Fair enough? But they did the best they can. And even if they did a terrible job, even if that was the best they could do, what's true today is that everyone sitting here, and most of you watching, if you're watching this right now, you are now capable of meeting your own needs. You see, the problem is that mom and dad didn't meet all your needs. And so what happens? What happens when they don't? Well, what happens is we wind up getting stuck, emotionally stuck, in some ways, at that place where those needs never got met. And so Dr. Margaret Paul, who co-founded something called inner bonding, the idea that we have inside of each of us, there's a little 2 or 3 year old version still there where we got stuck. And that the only way to get beyond that is to begin dialoguing with that inner child, your own inner child. Telling that little you that you love him or her, and assuring that little you that you will meet all of his or her needs. And I spent quite a bit of time talking to Margaret and actually worked with her a bit and got pretty friendly with her, and I said to her at one point, Margaret, how long, and Margaret's now probably in her mid-70s, maybe close to 80, and she invented this work maybe 40 years ago. I said, Margaret, how long did you do this work yourself to overcome your issues? Because that's why she invented it, was to deal with her own stuff. I said, how long did you do this work to overcome your own stuff? And she just started laughing. I said, what's so funny?